I was going to ask you, since you predicted the global financial crisis in 2008, what most worries you right now?
Global warming.
No, there's no others that compete.
Nothing else matters. I mean, we had our financial crisis in 2008, and nothing was done to address the causes of that. I'm actually writing a little piece on that right now because I'm commenting on Ted Cruz arguing that the Federal Reserve shouldn't pay interest on
Ted Cruz?
Ted Cruz.
The actor?
No,
the American.
Tom, Ted.
Oh, Tom Cruise. Okay. My bad.
That might increase the YouTube rating. You never know. No. So Ted Cruz discovered that the Federal Reserve is paying interest on reserve balances of financial institutions or banks. So they pay interest on bonds. He knew that. Now he's finding they're paying interest on reserves as well.
Okay.
Why are they doing that? Because they stuffed up with the global financial crisis. They thought it was actually good to have more private sector borrowing when that's what caused the bloody global financial crisis. So you've got this absolute craziness over interest payments in the States. So, and then government debt and so on. I've lost my train of thought, by the way. You better drag me back again.
He was asking about global warming.
Global warming. Okay. Anyway, so all this, pardon me, there was a big diversion. I got caught up in something else. We are in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. Nothing's being done to solve its impact. What that means is that to have a serious crisis, you've got a serious increase in the level of private debt. Now, because we haven't reduced private debt much from where it was at the peak of the global financial crisis, there's not this potential for that huge increase in credit at the same time. So if you look at the American economy in 2006, the increase in private debt that year was equivalent to 15% of GDP. And that boosted aggregate demand and income. Something else I had to prove that my fellow post-Keynesians hadn't worked it out, but it's easy to show that credit is part of aggregate demand and income. So if you have people borrowing an amount of money equivalent to 15% of GDP in a year, they're boosting aggregate demand by 15%. Then when the crisis hit, people are going bankrupt, paying back their debts. Everybody's having willing to go into debt to buy assets that are rising in value. When they started to plunge, people were trying to get out of debt. So it went from plus 15% in 2006 to minus 5% in 2009. Now that's in 20% of GDP turnaround in aggregate demand. What we should have done, and we did this by accident after the same thing happened back in the 1920s, huge increase in private debt, and then a financial collapse. And then over time, both the Great Depression and World War II meant that private debt level fell from about 140% of GDP in America down to 50%. So that meant that by the time the Second World War ended, you had to have credit-based demand without increasing the level of private debt too much for some substantial time. Then we got caught up in another bubble, just like the 1920s. The 1990s were like the 1920s in the sense that you had the Roaring 20s, the huge bubble there of telecommunications. Well, the bubble then was radio, radio and telegraph and other communication systems. A large part of the money was going into those sorts of stocks, the beginning of TV and stuff like that. So people were borrowing money to gamble on rising prices of shares in these companies. And you had a real estate bubble back there in as well. We repeated the same damn thing in the 90s and the early noughties up to 2007, then it all came crashing down. Now, the 1920s thing eliminated the overhang of private debt, but the 2007 crisis, the overhang is still there because people like Bernanke and all the conventional economists they thought increasing private debt was a good idea. They had no fucking idea about how big it was. They had the data. They never looked at the data. They misinterpreted the data. I've seen published papers where they clearly mistake the rate of change of debt for the level of debt. It's a huge error. So not understanding money, not understanding private debt, they try to encourage us back into it. And the spending they did, all the TARP program and the stimulus programs under Obama, they basically meant that private debt fell from about 170% of GDP to 150%, and it sort of stabilised that level. Well, that's such a high level of debt to begin with that most people are going to be wary about taking out debt for some project, and banks are sort of wary about lending too much. So you're not getting a large amount of credit-based demand. It's peaking at about 8%, maximum, say, 10% of GDP, but it'll then fall back down again. So you need a big swing around, and that means a big level of credit followed by a big fall. We're only getting a small level of credit, so I can't see a big fall coming out overall out of that. So I don't expect an internal crisis in the financial sector to hit the value of financial assets. But at the same time, again, economists are to blame. Idiots like William Nordhaus, who argued that climate change of 3 degrees by 2100 would only reduce the level of economic activity in 2100 by 3% compared to what it would have been in the absence of global warming. So 3 degrees is trivial. That's garbage. He has no idea of what he's talking about. And therefore, we've added so much heat to the global atmosphere and the global oceans as well. At some point, we're going to see catastrophic breakdown of our capacity to produce output. We're going to see storms that mean that parts of the world, like Florida, for example, you won't be able to get insurance anymore. The insurance system will fall over. And when we realise just how serious this threat is, then all the valuations we have for all the private companies are going to be, holy shit, that's wrong. How do I get my money out of there? We're likely to see a stock market crash from realising how serious global warming is rather than anything done by the financial sector itself.
And then that include damn.
Sorry?
No, I was just
crazy.
Yeah,
it's a shame because it's sort of no one talks about the climate crisis so much anymore. It's kind of been put on the back burner.
Yeah, reason being that the side that disputes it and trivialises it has won.
Yeah,
they've won the political debate.
Yeah.
Most people, even people who still think that global warming is dangerous, have been sort of lulled into the expectations economists have pumped out about the scale of change. And frankly, that's not very big. I mean, there's a bunch of economists were surveyed, economists who'd written on climate change in the top 25 economics journals, were surveyed back in 2020 in a paper by people here called Howard and Sylvan. And one of the questions they asked about what damages to GDP do you expect out of a trajectory towards 7 degrees of warming by 2200, so 2 centuries away, 7 degrees of warming. The median prediction from those economists was a 20% fall in GDP in 2200. The average is 25%. Now that translates into about a 0.1% fall in the rate of economic growth because you're talking 2 centuries away. So it's going to be 20% difference is a tiny difference in the rate of growth. So if you could actually imagine a planet where there was no global warming, so no fossil fuels and all the other fictional things you'd need for that, that would grow a tiny fraction faster than our economy where you're using fossil fuels, you're going to have global warming. The difference in growth rates is about 0.1%. Now, the question that they asked gave numbers out of Nordhaus's DICE program, where he estimated that in the absence of global warming, the global economy would grow by 1.5% per annum. Okay? So this bunch of economists said, 7 degrees of warming, 2 centuries hence, will go rather than 1.5, we'll go at 1.4. You couldn't tell the difference. Okay? Now, 7 degrees of warming, you speak to climate scientists, they say maybe lizards will survive.
Wow.
Okay? Because that level of warming that rapidly in terms of, geological scale of events has never occurred in the history of the planet except when the meteor hit that wiped out the dinosaurs. Right? To get that fast a change in temperature, you've got to that's the only comparable event. And 85% of species died at the time, and they think something of the same. Like if we go towards 7 degrees, okay, then I'll quote one of my favourite papers on this topic, published in a science journal, Sue and Ramanathan, 2017, and they said, please keep below 2 degrees of warming. It was sort of pleading to say stay below 2. And they there used to be a category of dangerous warming, and that dangerous warming was 1.5 degrees or more. That's where the Paris Accords came from. And they said, we're going to fine-tune this and say 1.5 degrees is dangerous, 3 degrees is catastrophic, and 5 degrees, anything more than 5 degrees, is beyond catastrophic, including existential risks. In other words, we probably won't exist as a civilization and maybe won't exist as a species.
Wow.
That's what we're playing with. So because everybody's accepted, without realising it, they see these statements in the paper saying 20% fall in GDP. And there's the most recent one by, I think it's Kolz, K-O-L-Z, and a couple of other authors published last year. They said there'd be a 19% fall in GDP in 2050, which is quite a large fall over that period of time. But to be a 19% fall in 2050 compared to what it would have been without the additional warming between now and 2050, that is something like about a 1% fall in the rate of economic growth. They're still talking positive economic growth. So everybody's accepting stuff which implies that global warming is not catastrophic. Talk to the scientists, it's catastrophic.
So where does that fall in GDP come from? Is it...
Oh, imagine you starve to death.
Yeah, well...
Okay.
But is it, because for example, here you mentioned something I hadn't thought about, is the speculation over, for example, like real estate or insurance companies, like the fall of many markets that we're used to, right? If Florida is flooded, all of a sudden, the real estate is valueless.
You can't sell the houses if they're underwater. Yeah. So that's the slowest growing form of danger, rising sea level. Okay, and everybody, if you talk about it, people, it's going to take a few hundred years for Greenland to melt and West Antarctic.
And then they say we'll adapt,
etc. You can't adapt if, for example, there's a day of extreme temperatures over the Iowa wheat crop, say temperatures of 45, 50 degrees, low humidity, that can burn the entire crop in a day. Or you could have a flood come through. And the flood, like in Greece just recently, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a flood in the northern section that literally inundated, they created a new lake where there used to be agricultural output. So suddenly there's no more food, no more wheat coming out of that part of Greece. You've got to import it from somebody else. All you need is 2 or 3 of those to happen at much the same time, and there is no somebody else to import from. So you could get to the point where there's not enough food for every person on the planet. Now, how do you decide who starves to death in that situation? But that's what we're playing with. And like there's a range of things which you have to read the science literature to realise what scientists are talking about as potential threats. But one of the most scary ones in terms of the credibility of the person who proposed it is that the guy who discovered the hole in the ozone layer, okay? We know we addressed that back with chlorofluorocarbons back in the 1980s and so on, found a different way to make freezing devices and got rid of that hole. He is the global expert on ozone and atmospheric chemistry. He's professor of atmospheric chemistry at Harvard. You don't get much more solid mainstream science credentials than that. Anderson's his last name. I can't think of his first name. But he argued that, and again, this is based on empirical research into what's happening with carbon dioxide levels and atmospheric dynamics in America. If you get, I think it's 500 parts per million carbon dioxide, we're already about 430. You get to 500 parts per million, that increases the temperature of the Gulf of America, okay? And means an increase in the moisture levels of storms that get to the western plains of America, meaning that you get superstorms that will penetrate not just the level we live, the troposphere, which is where we live, it's below 10 kilometres, but it gets into the stratosphere, which is 10 kilometres and up. And the troposphere which we live in has obviously got a lot of moisture, air content. There's water vapour everywhere. Okay, so and water vapour rises with rising temperature, but the stratosphere is very dry. And the stratosphere is also where the ozone layer occurs. It's a very, very large range of the stratosphere where there's a preponderance of O3, rather than O2. And then O3 happens to be a very effective means of preventing ultraviolet radiation getting down. So that was one reason we can go out during the day. We don't need, it's a suntan lotion for the planet in that sense. Well, he argued that when these storms start developing over the Midwest, they will reach into the stratosphere. So the storm will then take moisture from the troposphere into the stratosphere, and it will also take, and again, he's a professor of atmospheric chemistry. I'm an amateur on chemistry, but he says bromide and chlorine will both be brought into the troposphere. Then bromide and chlorine and water vapor together develop a catalytic process that destroys ozone. So he said once we hit 500 parts per million, it's quite likely the ozone layer will break down. Now, if the ozone layer breaks down, that's goodbye life on the planet, okay? We couldn't go outdoors during, say, daylight hours anymore. Okay? Agriculture will be, apparently plants have got quite a high level of protection against ultraviolet. Animals don't. So the animal population would start to fall. Humans couldn't go outdoors during daylight without putting on massive amounts of sunblock. If you get about 50, that's not going to be enough. Not that I know, but that sort of scale. So that's what we're playing with, those sorts of catastrophic changes. The big one for Europe, have you heard of what's called the AMOC?
No.
Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation.
No.
Okay.
I think you talked to us
in the first.
I talked about it the first time, I think, yeah. It's a huge system of ocean currents driven by both temperature differences and salinity differences, and it links all the oceans. It links the Antarctic to the Arctic as well. The amount of water fasting is about 50 times the volume of all the rivers on the planet. And as it happens, the part of the current that goes through the Atlantic comes up and curves around the coast of Europe where it's still warm, and then it cools and sinks and comes back down under. Now, the loop where it's floating on the surface is because it's highly saline. Again, I'm no expert on the chemistry, but it's highly saline, and that's part of the whole mechanism. Because we're melting so much ice water from Greenland and also from the Arctic, that is diluting that salt, which means that process may stop. And it has stopped in geological time in the past. Now, that would mean, on average, an average fall in the temperature of northern Europe of 10 degrees. And it also would make winters much more extreme. So winters would be much colder, summers would be slightly warmer, but this dramatic increase in the range of temperatures that applied. So summers would be hotter than they are now, winters would be freezing. You could get extreme events, not common, but extreme events where London would hit minus 20 degrees Celsius. Now, if you have that applying over the whole continent, then parts of it are going to turn back into glaciers again.
Wow.
Okay? Now, could you have, if the AMOC breaks down, life in Europe is likely to be unsustainable.
Wow.
So that's what we're toying with. And like when you look at the original studies into this area, scientists had discovered the AMOC. This is partly when you look at how the ships used to sail from Europe to America and back again. They found themselves using effectively these currents. They weren't even aware what they were. And then, of course, a bit of research. There's one current on the surface, which is the Gulf Stream, driven by the rotation of the Earth and wind effects out of that. Then there's this bottom one, which means you can have a current going up to Europe and sort of brushing the coast of Africa, and then coming down, brushing the coast of America. Ships used to use that as a way of using less energy and less time to travel between the two. We never thought they'd break down. Then you get people analysing, it has broken down in the past, and now they're looking at what temperature will it take to break it down. It's all brand new research in the sense that it was never necessary to consider that 30 or 40 years ago. So when the first study was done by climate scientists about what temperature they thought would cause the AMOC to break down, the range was 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. Okay. Now with more and more study, more and more mathematical models and so on, they're now thinking the range is somewhere between 1.2 and 3 degrees. Wow. Now we're already at 1.5. Okay. So the possibility is there that the AMOC could break down. And then again, it was all new studies trying to work out if this is going to happen, how fast would it happen. The studies are saying that there could be a rate of decline of temperatures in Europe, not globally. The globe would stay much the same average temperature because this just distributes heat around the globe. It isn't a net heat source. They say that it could be the rate of change of temperature could be as fast as 3 degrees per decade. Now, 3 degrees per decade falling temperature with a terminal temperature 10 degrees below, the possibility that Europe could survive that, both its agricultural systems and its transport and everything else. Homes would be inadequate. You wouldn't have enough insulation during winter. Okay, that's places which are double glazed wouldn't be enough. You'd have more need for energy to keep them warm. And then that accelerates fossil fuel use and so on. It's chaos. You don't want to play with this shit. But economists have thought the whole damn thing is a cost-benefit exercise. And they've said, we can play with this shit with no danger. And because most people don't realise how fucking hopeless garbage research has been done by these economists, they take the numbers seriously.